Hi, I'm Terry Moe. I'm a professor of political science at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I'm here today to talk to you about the teachers' unions and the prospects over the next number of years of possibly undermining or reducing their power so that education reform can move ahead more productively. So let me begin at the beginning. Education reform in this country really began big time in 1983 with The Nation at Risk, and that was 30 years ago. So here we are in 2017. We're still saying that we need fundamental reform of the education system because it is not providing our kids with a quality education. We're saying that because the modern era of reform has been a failure. We really haven't gotten very far. After all this time, 6% of the kids are in charter schools. We still have accountability systems that don't really hold anybody accountable. These are reforms that just don't work very well. Why? The reason is that these reforms, throughout the entire period, have been powerfully resisted. Now, in any institutional system, attempts to reform institutions will be opposed by vested interests that have a stake in those institutions that benefit from them. This is true in agriculture, it's true in defense, it's true in education. Now, in education, the most powerful vested interests are the teachers' unions. And they have, in fact, been the major obstacles to reform. And they've done it through what I call the politics of blocking. We have a separation of power system. That system sets up all sorts of veto points that make it very difficult to actually pass major legislation, but make it much, much easier to block, because all you have to do is block at one veto point. And so if you're a vested interest and your main goal is to block, to stop things from happening, you have a huge advantage. And I think throughout this entire period, the teachers' unions have not only been powerful, they've also had the advantage of the strategy of the politics of blocking, and it's worked very well for them. So, why is it that the teachers' unions oppose reform? And the answer is rooted in their interests. The teachers' unions are all about jobs. I think it's easy to sort of personalize it and think that, Randy Weingarten just doesn't care about kids, or too many teachers just don't care about kids. But I think that's not true. They do care about kids. They do care about schools. They want the schools to be good. But that's not the union's job. The union's job is to represent the job interests of members, to protect their jobs, to see to it that no one loses a job, to see to it that their pressures on the job are as low and as acceptable as possible. The teachers are what teachers want. And so the focus is entirely on those job interests and not on the quality of the schools. And so when it comes to something like school choice, you can say, wow, these kids in an urban area, many of them are trapped in bad schools. Choice gives them opportunities to get out. But for the unions, this is very threatening because it allows kids and money to leave the regular public schools, and that means that the unions are going to lose members, the unions are going to lose money, union members are going to lose jobs. All of these things are totally unacceptable from the standpoint of the union's interest. It doesn't matter what the impact is on children. Accountability. Right? Accountability is a problem because it puts the focus on performance. It means that teachers are likely to have their performance measured. They're going to be evaluated. Some teachers are going to be unsatisfactory. Their jobs might be lost. They don't want to lose jobs. Right? They really don't want teachers seriously evaluated. These things are threatening. And so whatever the impacts might be on the school system, the teachers' unions have incentives to oppose these things. And that's what they do. They oppose choice, they oppose accountability. Those are the two major movements of the American reform era. How can we get education reform in the face of all this opposition? The standard response especially coming from Democrats, is, well, we need to try to cooperate with the unions. We need to involve them in a collaborative process so that they can help write the details of reforms. They can participate in implementation and so on, to try to get them on board this reform train. But the problem with that is that it flies in the face of the union's interests. If they're involved and they have any kind of power at all in a collaborative process, they're going to use collaboration to weaken and undermine the reforms themselves because they don't like the reforms. They don't want choice. They don't want accountability. So collaboration is really a formula for failure, much as it might sound like a good thing. The problem for Democrats is that the unions are right at the heart of the Democratic coalition. And so the Democrats really can't support, or most of them can't support, undermining union power because they benefit from union. They want the unions to be powerful because it's good for Democrats. So the fallback position has to be, well, okay, we need to accept powerful unions, and that means we need to bring them into the reform process. But the problem there is it doesn't work. Okay. So what is the path to education reform? Well, the only way to get it is for reformers to be more powerful than the teachers' unions, which is difficult, and or for reformers to push for legislation or for court cases that will ultimately undermine the power of the unions, right? Reduce their power so that reforms can get passed. And both these things are happening to some extent, and they're more likely to happen now than they ever were in the past. So let me talk a little bit about that. On the left, there is a contingent within the Democratic Party and among liberals that favors reform. They recognize the unions as a problem. They want to do something about this. President Obama was a reformer. Arne Duncan was a reformer. Race to the Top was a reform effort, right, to push for real teacher evaluations, to grow the number of charter schools, and in other ways to bring about reforms that the unions were dead set against. So you have to give Obama a lot of credit as a Democrat for doing these things despite the union's opposition. There are important organizations out there now, Democrats for Education Reform, Teach for America, philanthropists like Gates and Broad, all of whom are known for being at least moderately to the left of center, if not quite liberal. Yet they see the unions as a problem for education reform. They are no fans of the unions. Liberal commentators and columnists for Time Magazine, Washington Post, they criticize the unions all the time. So on the left, there are plenty of people who see the unions as a problem. Their only dilemma is they like unions, right? And they feel that the Democrats need the unions in order to be powerful, so they're sort of stuck. They won't go all the way and say, okay, we need to undermine their power. Now, Republicans don't face that dilemma because the unions don't support them. Okay, so since the 2010 elections and the rise of the Tea Party, Republicans have been much more aggressive at trying to actually do something about the teachers' unions. The classic case now is what Scott Walker did in Wisconsin in 2011, passing major legislation there that really cut back on collective bargaining, restricting it just to wages, and also later adopting a right-to-work law. And since then, membership in the teachers' union has gone way down. You know, they have much less money. They're much less of a political force than they were before. Michigan and Indiana have adopted right-to-work laws. There are paycheck protection provisions that don't allow for automatic deduction of union dues by the employer. In a number of states, this really cuts into, or can cut into, union coffers, make it much more difficult for them to do their business. So lots of things have been happening. Now, while this is a big development, I think, by comparison to the past, the problem is that the unions are still powerful, the politics of blocking still operates, and you shouldn't think that Republicans are just gung-ho to do this. I mean, I think a lot of Republican governors look at what happened to Governor Walker and they say, oh my God, I don't want that to happen to me, right? He was faced with 100,000 demonstrators in the Capitol. He was faced with a recall election, and they don't want that. So I think it put the fear of God into them. And you shouldn't expect every Republican governor to try to push for the same things. Also, a lot of Republican legislators are from rural areas or from suburban areas. And school boards and teachers unions in those areas are important players who are well connected and who have a lot to do with how even these Republicans get elected. And many Republican legislators are not eager to do things that the unions and their own school boards don't like. So this thing is not going to be a cakewalk, but I think things are much better there than they used to be. Now, how about at the national level? Well, okay, now we have a Republican Congress, we have a Republican president. What's likely to happen there? Well, the biggest thing is the nomination of Gorsuch to the Supreme Court, because there is a case that will soon, I'm sure, come to the Supreme Court about right-to-work legislation for public sector workers. The Friedrichs case, which was about that, would have gotten the consent of the Supreme Court were it not for the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. As a result, the vote was 4-4. Well, with Gorsuch on the court, right-to-work is likely to get the approval of the Supreme Court, and that's going to have, I think, a big impact on the membership of the teachers' unions and therefore on their money and on their power. Okay, so when it comes to actual legislation that might be passed or rules by the Department of Education, what can they do? Well, let me take a step back. I think Republicans these days are way into local control. They get sort of teary-eyed when they think about local democracy. This is the way to do things. I think they need to be more strategic about that. You know, they saw No Child Left Behind as an exercise in overreach, even though they voted for it in 2001, and ultimately participated in passing the Every Student Succeeds Act very recently, which essentially did away with accountability by pushing it down to the state and local levels and giving them the discretion to hold schools accountable. But what it all ignores is that the teachers' unions and the school districts are entrenched vested interests that are most powerful at the local level. And what this act does is it puts more and more power in the hands of the vested interests who do not want to be held accountable. So I think if Republicans really want to achieve reform, they have to be more strategic in thinking about local control. And not think that just by letting 1,000 flowers bloom, you're actually going to get 1,000 flowers. I think what you're likely to get is nothing or very little because of the way power is structured. Okay, so what can they do? Well, I think a big part of the solution here is pushing school choice, which Trump favors, which Betsy DeVos favors, and which, in addition to being, I think, good for schools and kids, also is an indirect way of fundamentally undermining the power of the teachers' unions. Because what it does is to allow kids and money to flow from the unionized public schools into charters and possibly into private schools. And that alone reduces membership, reduces money, reduces power. Also, unions have a very difficult time organizing each school, school by school, rather than organizing whole districts. So looking ahead, it makes it very difficult for them to reconstruct their power. And also, they can't impose the collective bargaining contracts on the schools, and the schools will be freed up to do their own thing. So I think school choice is a good way of pursuing education reform, getting local control. This is the ultimate in local control, and undermining the power of the unions at the same time. Okay, so I think all in all, what we're looking at here is a period of time in which we have, the nation has, an extraordinary opportunity to move education reform ahead, and in which the teachers' unions are going to be on the defensive and are very vulnerable to efforts both at the state level and at the national level to undermine their power. And to the extent these efforts are successful, I think it will give a boost to education reform. So, there's much more to say. I'm sorry I had to rush through this, but I'm open to any questions you might ask, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thanks a lot.